Hey, everybody. So the last time we talked about the Annapolis Convention, business leaders, political leaders had tried to get the states to meet in Annapolis, Maryland to discuss issues with the Articles of Confederation, but only 5 of the 13 states had shown up. And so they went to the Confederation Congress to ask for an official call. And the Confederation Congress did so and said, let's meet next year in 1787 in Philadelphia. And the purpose of this meeting was to revise the Articles of Confederation. That's the stated purpose. Now they get a little bit better turnout. 12 of 13 states show up, Rhode Island being the one state that doesn't show up, but that's pretty good. And roughly, and I say roughly because the numbers change somewhat, roughly 75 to 77 delegates show up, or appointed, let me rephrase that, but only 55 ever show up because others get delayed and things happen and they don't make it. The average daily attendance of the convention, though, in Philadelphia is 30. And they meet in the same place where they did the Declaration of Independence. So now that we know how many are there, who were these people? Well, they were your business leaders, your wealthy, your educated elites that were there. They tended to be a younger group, the average age around 42. Of course, Ben Franklin being the oldest at 81. There was a guy named Dayton out of New Jersey who was 26. 42, still pretty young. I know we know that life expectancy was 36, but that includes childhood deaths. So if you could get to, back then, if you could get to 21, you probably lived into your 60s and 70s. So those are the age groups. And then there's some famous people there we should talk about. First off, George Washington. You wanted to get George Washington there so that you would have credibility. Everybody loved George Washington. Washington had been retired since 1783, living in Mount Vernon, hearing the problems with the Confederation, and so they get him to come. Now, he doesn't say anything. He's just sort of the presence they need. He provides credibility to this whole event. Also there is going to be James Madison. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. He's from Virginia. It's mainly because his ideas are the ones that are incorporated into our present Constitution. Now, he's all about 5'1". He wears all black because his fiance had dumped him for a doctor. But he was a very smart guy. He brought a lot of books and apparently had a very weak voice. And so he's always having people yelling for him to speak up. But yeah, he's known as the father of the Constitution. Also, there is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is sort of the visionary for the new country. He was not from the New England states or the middle colonies or southern states. He was from the West Indies, and he had immigrated to the United States and served in the Continental Army, became a trusted favorite of George Washington. And for Hamilton, he could see that the country could be great if it could get just past through all this squabbling they were doing back and forth between the sectional differences. He was saying, look, we've got this big ocean that's between us and everybody else. That's great. And we have these natural resources out toward the west. We could be a very major power. One of Hamilton's problems is that nobody likes him. He tends to be arrogant. He's the smartest guy in the room, and he knows it. And so that's going to be Hamilton's issue for a while, that people just don't like him. Also there is Roger Sherman from Connecticut. He's good at getting people to compromise. And so that'll come important here a little bit later on. We also see James Wilson, one of the nation's top attorneys and early Supreme Court justice. John Dickinson, one of the early leaders of the Revolution. And of course, Maryland's Luther Martin. Luther Martin was a big states' rights advocate, and so he was known for his fiery oratory. Now, some people that were not there, one of them, of course, was Godzilla. He was not there. But John Adams is not there. John Adams, the Atlas of the Revolution, according to Jefferson, was not there. He was the ambassador to Great Britain. Jefferson's not there. He's the ambassador to France. And then there are 3 people that are noteworthy for not being there. And that was Sam Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry. Now, Sam Adams was one of the early people that got the revolution going. You don't hear a lot about him unless you think of beer. But he was sort of a rough customer in a lot of ways. And so when they started writing the history of the revolution, they didn't really want to put Sam Adams in there because they didn't think he was a good role model for young people. But he certainly had his part to play. John Hancock, you all remember, he was one of the richest people in the colonies, and he'd signed his name really large on the Declaration of Independence. And then Patrick Henry, you all know, was the man who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He doesn't show up at the convention because he feels that, as he says, he smells a rat. These three are sometimes referred to as the old revolutionaries, that they got the country independent. They started that revolution. But now there's a new group of people, a younger people, Madison, Hamilton, who say, thanks for getting us independent, but we need a different form of government. And so what the convention's going to be is, it's going to be a revolution again, but this time it's not fought with bullets, but it's fought with words. Now, early on, they decided to take some important steps. One, make George Washington the president of the convention, because everybody respected him and they wouldn't argue with Washington. Two, they decide they're going to keep the meeting a secret, not because they're involved in a conspiracy or anything like that. It's because they wanted everybody to say what they wanted to say, throw out any idea they wanted to throw out without being held politically accountable back home. And once they got the plan out there, then they would reveal it to the public. But they wanted a free and open debate. In fact, they do a very good job of keeping it a secret. What we know about the convention comes from James Madison's diaries, which were published after his death, I think in 1841. And they're fairly detailed, but we also know that recent scholarship has shown that he actually changed his diary as the years went on, maybe to make some people look worse than they were and some people look better, depending on the particular emotions. So they decide to keep it a secret, and they do it. Things don't leak out like they do today. And then they decide they're going to scrap the articles. They say, look, they just don't work, we're going to start all over. Partly this is because the people who showed up first at the meeting wanted to scrap the articles, and they took early votes. Now, they were there only to revise it, so already you're getting a little bit of controversy as they decide to scrap the articles. So if you're going to get rid of the articles, that means that you're going to have some sort of replacement plan. And there are two major ones. One is the Virginia Plan by James Madison, which called for a bicameral legislature, two-house. The lower house would have representation based on population and be elected by the people, which would be white male landowners. And then the upper house would be selected by the lower house and also have representation based on population. So this would favor the larger states. And of course, the largest state was at the time Virginia, not a surprise there. The Virginia Plan also called to have some sort of executive branch and judicial branch and additional powers given to the national government. Now, conversely, there was the New Jersey Plan. It was introduced by, I believe, William Patterson. And it's really what they were there supposed to do, revise the articles. It kept a unicameral legislature, just like the articles. Each state got one vote, just like the articles, but they would give additional powers to the national government, the power to tax, regulate commerce, things of that nature. So it's really a revision of the articles, what they were supposed to do in the first place. So which plan are they going to go with? Well, they're going to go with the Virginia Plan. We know that because we have a bicameral legislature today. But there was the issue of representation. Was representation going to be population, or was it going to be equal, right? In the Virginia Plan, it was based on population. In the New Jersey Plan was each state getting one. So they're going to need some sort of compromise, and it better be a good compromise. Nope, it better be a great compromise, sometimes known as the Connecticut Compromise because of Roger Sherman. The Great Compromise said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a bicameral legislature with the lower house being elected by the people with representation based on population, serving 2-year terms. And then we'd have an upper house, the Senate, which would serve a 6-year term. Each state would get 2. They'd be equal no matter how big the state is in population. Each would get 2. And they would be selected by state legislatures. And it was that way until the 20th century, by the way. And so that was the split they came up with under the Great Compromise. So it's a little bit of A and B. in that regard. So you think about Texas with 28 million people, we get 2 senators, and then Montana with 385,000 gets 2 senators. And then the House is based on population. Now, when you look at the terms of office, 2 and 6 years, that was pretty unheard of. In Massachusetts, they had elections every year. But the idea was that the House would be a much more emotional body, because you would run the election for 1 year, then you have to serve, and then you'd have to run again the next year. So you had to pay close attention to public opinion. And so it was considered a somewhat more radical body. But in the Senate, you were insulated by state legislatures. You were insulated by 6-year terms, so that you could think things through and not be so swayed by the emotions of the time. Well, if you're going to have representation based on population, that means you have to count everybody. You have to do a census. And then the question became is, who do you count? And the big question is, what do you count slaves? And this was a debate. Southern states said yes, because states like South Carolina were 60% slave. Northern states said no, because you don't treat slaves as people in any other way. But Southern states wanted to count them because they were fearful that this new government would be dominated by Northern interests and might eventually abolish slavery. So they came up with another compromise, and that was the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise said that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation and tax purposes. And so that's going to give Southern states more representatives than they probably would have gotten under a fair system. And that's going to play a role a little bit later. Part of the 3/5 compromise also agreed to ban the importation of slaves after 1808. Now, that would be 20 years after the Constitution was written. Now, that sounds positive that they were going to stop it, but we do know that historians estimate that between 1808 and 1860, probably 600,000 slaves were brought into the country illegally. It also created a thriving domestic market, which broke up families, and the slave population continued to grow. They knew slavery was an issue, they knew it was a problem, but they knew they couldn't discuss it in the Constitution without getting the Southern states to walk out. So that brings us up to the executive branch. They know they need a chief executive, but they're fearful of a chief executive. They don't want to give one person too much power. One of the ideas was, maybe have a plural executive. Have you elect a lot of different members of the executive branch, like we do in Texas. But what they decided to do was go with a single executive, elected to a 4-year term, and elected indirectly by the people through the Electoral College. The Electoral College, again, designed because they didn't trust you. That was a problem. They didn't trust you. And so originally, you could run as many times as you want. George Washington is the person that says you can only run once, and you should only run twice, rather, and that's enough. And it started a tradition that no one broke until Franklin Roosevelt. And then last part, the judicial branch. The judicial branch, they only mention one court, and that's the U.S. Supreme Court. And they said that judges would be appointed by the president with the consent of the Senate and serve lifetime appointments. And they would say, Congress, you can create all the lower court systems, which Congress will do with the Judiciary Act of 1789. So that's just a general outline of the Constitution. You can take entire courses on it, obviously. There's a lot more to it than that. We'll break it down a bit further. But in our next lecture, we'll talk about ratification of this new document and what were the issues with ratification. So pick up from there next time.